Thank you, Julie, and hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the IIRSM family member joining from across the globe. First of all, I would like to wish you all a happy and cheerful New Year. Hope everyone would have started this with full of positive vibes, energy. With this New Year, I'll be just taking you like past 12 months, which what we all have done in India branch, and to reflect and to share with you all. Starting with, we have reached 960 plus followers in our LinkedIn page, and soon we are going to cross 1K followers. I would say definitely all the family members of IIRSM, and a big thank you for all being connected with us throughout the past year. And as of 22, in India branch, we have 220 plus member, and still counting and growing day by day. So each month we have hosted a number of interesting webinars in the past month, and there were very great speakers like from top professionals to the like business persons, and who all talked in different topic like HOP, human and organizational performance, self-confidence and work life, mental health, matrices for measuring the safety culture, design and basic engineering, and many more. Like we had a good last year with full of insightful sessions with all of our great speakers. And after this, we also had a 1% safer grocery scheme in which many of our applicants from India, they have been selected and they have been given free membership from IISM at affiliate level. So that was also a great deal for all of the members in IISM, those who have been selected. And this all wouldn't have been possible with all your support, of our committee member, India branch committee members, the IISM team, and our great speakers who have contributed to their time. With this, I would like you welcome all to this webinar, the first webinar of our 2023. And today's speaker, Samantha Colonel, who is Master of Science in Public Health, CIH, President-elect International Occupational Hygiene Association. She is basically Global Health Program Director for Indorama Venture Public Limited. As a subject matter expert in Corporate EHS Center of Excellence, she develops and manages industrial hygiene program with insight of occupational health and health promotions. So I hope and I'm sure today's webinar you would be having full of insights, which different perspective, and this related to our industrial hygiene. We are going to have first time in our webinar, India branch webinar. So this will be a great sessions, and I hope you all members would enjoy it. So with this, I would like to hand over to our speaker, and over to you, Samantha.
Great, thank you so much, Mohit. Let's see, there we go. Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation today, and thanks to Julie for helping get everything set up. And I would like to thank all of the participants for spending some time with us this evening. So thanks for the introduction. A little bit more just to expand a little bit on my experience. As you mentioned, Master of Science in Public Health is basically means that I have a concentration specifically in industrial hygiene. Today, it's going to be used interchangeably between occupational and industrial hygiene, but basically it's the same thing. I'm from the US, and so that's why I have this notion of industrial in there. I moved to Europe in 2014, so I've been fortunate to have experience working on both continents and getting an idea of how to apply these occupational hygiene principles in both areas. The majority of my experience is in the chemical industry, and over the last couple of years, I've moved into a role in the corporate EHS team where I've had a little bit more exposure to some risk management principles and also kind of taking this integrated approach to risk management. I just have noted my hobbies as well because I do like to do a lot with occupational hygiene, but I also like to have fun in other ways in my free time, so doing some activities outdoors and spending time with friends and such. So I've got a little bit of an older picture on here of myself, but just kind of to note the experience on a manufacturing site. It's really I think, an exciting role to be able to work in production like that. And also, the picture in the bottom corner is from the IOHA board meeting this past fall in Bali, and it's been a really, really good experience also to work internationally with different occupational hygiene professionals. So just wanted to note that as well. Okay, so I'm not sure how many people on the call are familiar with occupational hygiene, so I've just got some definitions here. And the first one is the IOHA definition. So industrial hygiene is really the discipline of anticipating, recognizing, evaluating, and controlling health hazards in the workplace with the objective of protecting workers, but also the community at large. And on top of that, I've also included, it's listed here as the AIHA definition, but it's really kind of the textbook definition of occupational hygiene, but was listed on their website. So I really prefer this, or I really like this definition. It's kind of the one I grew up with, so to speak. And I like it because it refers to it as the art and science dedicated to the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, control, and now they've added also confirmation of protecting workers from these different stressors. And I've highlighted the art piece, but we'll talk about that a couple times throughout the presentation. And then just to be a little bit more clear on what the stressors are that we're going to talk about, it's really the science of protecting workers from hazardous agents such as chemicals, physical agents, and then biological agents as well. And in the bottom corner, you'll also see in the long and short term. So we're going to talk a little bit about acute and chronic effects and our role in protecting workers from those. So what is risk, actually? I'm speaking to a group of risk management professionals, so I just wanted to note again that for us, we consider risk to be the hazard times the exposure. And the exposure piece is really important in what we're going to talk about today, because that's really what our role is in all of this. So, for example, you can have, as we have these bottles sitting here, for example, on the shelf in a laboratory, maybe they're not being touched, they're closed, they're just sitting on the counter or under the hood for the moment. Without opening these bottles or really, manipulating these products, there's not much of an exposure. And so as soon as a worker starts working with these products in the open and can be exposed to them, so to speak, that's where the risk increases. And so when we talk about what we actually do, we refer to ourselves as exposure scientists, and maybe other people too, but mostly, as we say, we're familiar with the term exposure scientist. And this means really that we're practicing exposure risk management. In doing that, we anticipate and recognize potential hazards. As you know from part of the definition again, we measure and we evaluate the exposure levels. We recommend and we implement controls to reduce those exposures, and then also to verify the effectiveness of controls. We communicate these results to workers and to leadership. And then we also advise decision makers. So that can be, for example, in the company, can be regulators, it can be others on different occupational hygiene matters. And when do we do this? I've included this just to give an idea of when we would be involved in the process. So for example, if you have a manufacturing site, we would do initial risk assessments or exposure assessments to look at what do the current operations look like, what are exposures, are they at an acceptable level? And then we would come back in and do recurring assessments as needed. Anytime there's a change in operations, for example, if you're going to introduce a new chemical or change something within the process, we need to make sure that that doesn't affect the exposure. And then as well, we might be involved during acquisitions or due diligence just to have a look at what the company that we're thinking of purchasing, for example, what are the kind of risks or potential exposures that would be involved there. And then we can advise the company on how they should go about that. So here we have kind of an infographic to give you an idea of what we just discussed, but the first part mostly in our role is doing a hazard assessment. So looking at what are the potential hazards, and we'll go into a little bit more detail after that. Then we do the exposure risk assessment. So looking at of these hazards, what are the things that we actually have potential for exposure with? And then on top of that, we do exposure management. And then you see on the bottom, well, first then we confirm that everything that we've done or put in place is working. And on the bottom, you see again kind of the definition of our field broken up into this process. And this is, again, it's almost the same infographic with a little bit more information on the hazard assessment and exposure assessment. And I liked this one. I found it on the AIHA webpage. It has this piece around risk management on there. So they're noting that some important pieces of risk management in this piece are leadership commitment, hierarchy of controls, which we'll also talk about in more detail, and then confirmation of the controls and protection. So I want to talk about in pretty detail. It's an overview if you know the occupational field, but today we're going to delve into the OH principles in a little bit more detail. So the first one is anticipate. And when we say anticipate, what we really mean is imagining what are the potential hazards that could be associated with a potential business or process. When we talk about recognize, we mean being able to find where these hazards might occur in the process. After that, we collect exposure data and we evaluate if these exposures are acceptable or if they need to be reduced. And then we implement controls to potentially reduce them, any of the unacceptable exposures. And then after that, we're going to resample and review the controls that we've put in place to make sure that they're working. And so if you look at this wheel, I'm not sure what everybody's background is in the group, but it's also quite similar to other risk management concepts. So if you think about the ISO 31000 risk management wheel, it also includes, for example, risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, and then treatment. So I think it's not that different, actually, the principles. And maybe you'll see some parallels as we get into the next parts. So the hazards that we're talking about in a little bit more detail are really anything that could have an adverse effect on human health. And so we're looking at chemical hazards, we're looking at acute and chronic exposures. So acute meaning short-term and chronic meaning over the working life or long-term exposures. And we're looking at gases, solids, vapors. With regards to biological hazards, we're looking at bloodborne pathogens, Legionella, communicable diseases. Noise, we're looking also at acute and chronic exposures. So acute would mean like an impact noise, like a really loud bang, for example, in a process. Or we're looking at chronic exposures throughout the whole working day. Psychosocial hazards as well. This is, I would say, more well known throughout some areas of the world. In the US, for example, they're kind of just starting to look at this, but in Europe, it's written into a lot of the regulations to do psychosocial risk assessments. And here you're looking at stress, fatigue, workplace violence, isolated work, for example. Thermal stress, we're looking at exposure to extreme cold or heat. And I have extreme in parentheses because it doesn't always have to be that extreme to have an adverse impact on the worker. Radiation, ionizing and non-ionizing, both. And then ergonomic hazards. So we have kind of what we call industrial ergonomics, which would be in the plant, and also computer workstation ergonomics. So prolonged sitting or making sure that the office setup is correct. So when we get into talking about evaluating exposures, what we're really talking about is sort of measuring risk in occupational hygiene terms. So I've broken down the process of evaluating exposures into 3 steps. And the first one is a qualitative assessment. So that's where we say, yes, everything's okay. No, we think we have a problem. We need to look into it a little bit more. So what we're first going to do is assess the potential hazards that we have. So for example, if you identify in your process that you do have chemicals or noise, just as an example, you further look at that to see, how big of a potential problem could it be? And so one way of doing that, I've just included 2 examples on the screen here. You can break your process down into a flow and see where are the different areas where you could have different hazards. And then where you identify those, for example, chemicals, you can use hazard banding or you can use other ways to identify sort of what is the level of the hazard. that you're looking at. You're going to look at the quantities that you use, quantities of chemicals, for example. You're going to look at the frequency and duration of the work. So is it something that we do for 15 minutes a day? Is it something that we do for 3 hours a day, 5 times a week, for example? Those are all going to impact the outcome of the qualitative assessment. I've bolded here conducting field interviews and visits because I find that this is a really important part of this process. This is kind of where you really verify in real life what's going on in the field, and where you do interviews with workers and you talk to them about what their actual job is like, where do they see potential problems. And then we can also conduct exposure modeling to get an idea. What you're going to come up with is a risk rating or a risk ranking that's going to determine if you need to go further and if you need to conduct a quantitative assessment. So with regards to quantitative assessments, this is the actual measuring that we do. So it can be conducting air sampling, it can be doing noise monitoring, it can be looking at the thermal conditions or doing an ergonomics assessment. And I've put some examples here of just, some of the monitoring equipment that we would use in the field. And sometimes, so either you can do, for example, with chemical sampling, you could use analytical methods, but this is going to give you kind of a picture of what's happening over the workday. Or you could use real-time detection to give you an idea of, are there peaks in the process, or where could we have potential problems that we could really target in the process to improve. And if you see on the right side beside the calibrator and air sampling pump, there's a picture of kind of what a PID output would look like. So that gives you kind of the peaks to go along with that sort of average exposure. And then most other stressors we can measure with direct reading instruments or sort of real-time devices. So the noise dosimeter, for example, or the wet bulb globe temperature, these are going to give you a direct output of what the exposure is. After that, we analyze our data to have a look at if the exposures are acceptable or not. So we review the data and we verify our assumptions. I didn't go very much into detail, but what we usually do is try to group our workers into similar exposure groups. And this is because we can't really measure everything for all of the population. So we try to group the population into groups that would have similar exposures and then measure for a certain population within that group and extrapolate that out for the whole group. So in doing our statistical analysis, we can confirm whether or not our initial assumptions were correct. We can compare these results with the occupational exposure limits, and so that's going to tell us if it's acceptable or not, and how much residual risk is allowed, or what will we accept our workers to be exposed to. So as you can imagine, there's some professional judgment that goes into this. So I just wanted also to note here that there's a lot of work being done on how to sort of standardize that professional judgment to make sure that we're all making the same decisions about the risks that we're taking. Something else that I just want to note here is that we don't really, I won't say that there's zero exposure, but it's zero exposure for all workers is virtually impossible. So at some point, you do have to decide what's an acceptable amount of exposure that will allow for the workers and within this population. And so I'm not sure if you've ever heard the adage, but the dose makes the poison. And so all products or stressors have a certain amount that we can be exposed to without having adverse health effects. And so when we are looking at this data and deciding on what is acceptable or not, we're really saying, how much can we expose our working population to without having any issues? And so that's what we're doing here. So we're going to talk a little bit about controlling exposures. This is where I would like to remind you about the art in the definition of the art and science of occupational hygiene. The examples of controls that I've put here seem, very technical and straightforward, but for example, something we could implement would be to substitute one hazardous product for a more suitable one, safer alternative. It could be implementing ventilation, for example, to reduce an exposure, or enclosing a noisy process. It could also be reviewing or revising work procedures, having a look with the workers. What are they currently doing? How can we change that so that they're less exposed? And then also implementing PPE, personal protective equipment, such as a respirator or gloves or earplugs or anything like this. And I say that there's an art to it because it's not always straightforward. It can be that we want to implement a certain control, but that it might bring up a new risk that we didn't have before, or it can be that it's maybe not the best option that we have on the table, or it might be that it's not very practical for the worker. So I call it an art because I think it's really important to make sure that it's a solution that works for everyone while reducing the exposure. So perhaps in risk management language, we would refer to this as risk reduction measures. We refer to it often as the hierarchy of controls. And we say that because we have kind of our most preferred controls at the top, and these are also the most effective. So for example, in eliminating the hazard, we're really removing it from the situation. So the worker no longer has the option really to be in danger from that hazard. Substitution would be that we're replacing the hazard. So it could still be another hazard, but maybe a less hazardous one. For example, substituting one chemical for another one. It might have other issues, but perhaps it's no longer a carcinogen, a cancer-causing product, for example. Engineering controls. So this would be an example of ventilation or enclosing the noise source. So this is often elimination isn't possible. Substitution is sometimes possible, and very often we end up going with engineering controls. Administrative controls. This means that we're still kind of putting the burden on the worker. So this is also maybe not our preferred option. For example, changing the way that they work. It might not be that everybody follows those work procedures exactly as they should. So the hazard is still there and there's still the potential to be exposed to it. And it's basically the same thing with PPE. So it's not the preferred option. It's possible. And sometimes this is used for working with products that have acute issues, for example. Or it's used when maybe we don't have the budget or the time to implement something, or we use it as a sort of ad interim solution while we're implementing something that works better. And so I've borrowed this from Suva in Switzerland, and it's in German, I apologize, but I like how they have put the hierarchy of controls into a very easy way to remember. So they just say the STOP method, and that's looking at substitution, technical measures, which are engineering controls, organizational measures, which are administrative controls, and then personal protective equipment. And at the bottom, you see also that they have it by effectiveness, but if we look at this example that everyone can understand is the alligator, if you tie the alligator up and pull him from the ground, he's no longer that big of a risk for everybody. I wouldn't necessarily call this substitution, but it's better than if you had left him there. Technical, so you put the cage around the alligator, he's still there, but people are not in direct contact with him. Organizational, so you put a sign in front of the pond that says, don't go in, but the alligator can still come out, so you don't fully remove the risk or the hazard. And then the personal protective equipment is that you put somebody in a shield and with protection, but the alligator is still standing right in front of them. So I just like the way that they depict this. So I would like to talk about occupational hygiene in risk management, just kind of from my perspective, and maybe how some other occupational hygiene colleagues would see it as well. This is a snippet from the strategy that we have at IVL in Doroma Ventures. And know our risks is one of our EHS principles. We have 5, and that's the first one. And so I like to think that occupational hygiene can contribute to this very well, because I see us as helping the organization see invisible or not so commonly understood risks. And so we measure a lot. We measure quantitatively all of the things that we talked about before. We measure risks, exposures, we measure the fitness of our working population. So we do that with, pre-employment fitness for duty tests, for example. We do it with medical surveillance testing as well. And then we also look at the disease incidence in our working population. And just one other example of how we could contribute to this is characterizing the demographics that we have in our workplace. So, for example, the aging workforce. This can be a risk for several reasons. It can be that people get injured because of age, but also that, this is giving an idea, a depiction of where the retirement age is going to be and when we need to replace our working population. So I think we can help the organization see that in different ways. And I think also that we play a role in enterprise risk management. So I was lucky enough to participate in a course about 2 years ago through AIHA at their annual conference. And it was from Dr. Popov, who gave a course on, it was called Communicating Risk Pathways. I've put the name here on the right side in case anyone's interested. But really, the takeaway that I had there is that he talked about traditional risk management kind of being siloed. So finance only looks at finance, operations looks at operations, and health and safety wasn't necessarily a piece of that. But if you look at enterprise risk management in some newer, more integrated models, health and safety can really be the center of that in a way. So if you have good health and safety programs, you can help reduce insurance premiums, you can help enhance the reputation, and then you can also support operations by working together and also support sustainable operations by protecting your people. And so I think occupational hygiene plays quite a role there because we have, in everything that we spoke about before, I always refer to us as kind of the preventive side of medicine. So there can be a reactive side. It might be that workers have symptoms, and so we have to go in and do an investigation or do some monitoring to see if something is contributing to that. But for the most part, we're proactively going and doing these exposure assessments to make sure, one, that we're in compliance, but also that we're protecting our workers. And so I think that we play quite a role in this scheme of enterprise risk management. These are just some ideas that I have on how we will contribute in the future, or how we should start even maybe contributing now in occupational hygiene to risk management. And on some of these, we're a little late to the party, so to speak. For example, pandemic planning and support. We saw with the COVID-19 pandemic that really occupational hygienists did play a big role in looking at routes of exposure and looking at implementing controls. So ventilation ended up being a really good control for COVID-19. This is an area where I don't think we were very much involved before, and I think we have an opportunity to be in the future. There's been a lot designed around healthy buildings in the meantime and looking at indoor air quality and how that relates. So I think there's a tie there. Same thing with ESG. It's been around for a long time now, but it's getting really popular and we're finally starting to get involved there. So I think that health is very much related to the S, the social sustainability piece of it. And I think that in working together, we can help build a really good basis for companies. If you think about companies having socially sustainable programs, health and safety should really be the basis of that. Protecting your workforce is the #1 thing, I think. Psychosocial risk assessment and controls. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the presentation. This has been, I think, going on for a long time in Europe, but it's just very much that piece of the risk assessment. So companies do need to do a risk assessment, but I think that something new where we can contribute is the controls. So sort of looking at the risk treatment, if you will, or the implementing controls to reduce the actual stressors or the psychosocial risks. So, many companies have maybe identified, yes, stress is a problem, but what do we do really to combat that? So I think taking this approach of implementing controls and confirming that they're working is an important piece. And then also the future of work. So there are new work arrangements that we never had before. We have workers in their own homes where we need to make sure that they're still protected. And then we also have new technologies and potential risks like artificial intelligence or using a lot more robots, for example, in our processes. And we need to make sure that we're staying ahead of any risks that might be associated with this. And then just a piece on risk communication. I think that we have a lot of challenges in occupational hygiene in communicating what our profession does, but also the risks associated with the business. So one thing that I see is that it's a lot easier, for example, for companies to understand occupational or process safety risks. So fire and explosion is pretty clear. You know, if you have a process shut down, if you have a plant shut down because you have a fire, that's downtime that you're paying for, that's equipment you need to repair, that's a reputation as well. There's a lot of things associated with that the company can understand. But I think it's a lot more difficult for them to understand occupational lung disease or occupational cancer. So that's one difficulty that we have. I think not a lot of people know our field, and it's very full of technical language and requires perhaps a specific knowledge base, maybe just even in terms of vocabulary and concepts, but sometimes it's hard for us to communicate those. We have, like I mentioned, some acute risks that we manage, but it's a lot of chronic. So again, you know, the company is saying, why do we care about this today? This person might not even be in our company anymore in 20 or 30 or 40 years when they're going to suffer from this potential disease that you're talking about. So why is that important today? Sometimes we need to sell more than compliance. So I think at the very least, companies should be in compliance with any regulations or occupational exposure limits, but sometimes we need to sell more than that. And what I mean by that is occupational exposure limits, depending on where they're coming from. So a lot of regulatory bodies, for example, they're outdated and they're no longer protective of the workers' health. So sometimes we need to dig into the research and show numbers that are more conservative. And the company often wonders, you know, well, this number is a lot lower. Why do I need to comply with that one? So we have to convince them that it's about the health and not just compliance. And I think the last one is competing with operations sometimes. So oftentimes I think that leadership does want to do the right thing in a company, but it might be that, you know, perhaps they're going to divest a part of the company, or the business strategy is going to change, or there's no budget left for the year for what we want to improve. So sometimes either we kind of get moved to the side, any of the improvements we want to make, or we have to kind of live with a certain situation that maybe it's acceptable for the moment, but it's maybe not the ideal situation that we would have implemented, for example. And so I think some potential solutions, maybe to go with some of those points, are to make sure that we're working together with other EHS disciplines, but also with other risk, you know, with other colleagues in the company, like risk management, just to make sure that when we do choose solutions, that they're things that work for everybody. Because often, you know, if we're able to pull our arguments together to improve something, the company is more likely to say yes. I think speaking in terms that make sense to the audience and removing a lot of the technical jargon that we have in our field will help also. Making data-driven arguments. So we shouldn't, you know, when we go to management and we say we need to improve this, it's not just because we should do it because it would be good for the worker. It's because we have the data showing that this person could potentially be overexposed, or, you know, there's a regulatory change and we have this product on our site that's going to be banned in the future, for example. Bringing the data. Bring the data, not the drama, is a saying that I like to use sometimes. Being able to communicate financial and strategic consequences. So also being able, for example, to calculate the return on investment on maybe some of the controls that we would like to implement. I think that is a way that we can rather speak to the business than saying, this is the most effective control for XYZ. Being able to say, look, if we implement this, it will be paid back in X amount of time and we won't have this compliance issue anymore. And a concept that I really like to use when I'm talking to people about some of these chronic health effects is the future self. So being able to imagine yourself in the future or making decisions for your future self and not just for you today. This is very hard, I think, even for our own personal decisions, but speaking in that way and communicating these sort of ideas of chronic health effects helps people understand a bit better. And I think just being able to arm the decision makers around us, so leadership or others, and being able to help prioritize the issues and bring solutions. So being open enough to work together to find something that works for everybody. And so just a few key takeaways that I'd like to share with you. I do think that occupational hygiene is a piece of the risk management puzzle. I think that we play a valuable role in determining what the potential exposures could be and acceptable risks that we can take as a company. I think that the principles that we have, the 5 that we discussed today, it's a good framework and it matches some other risk management frameworks for identifying where the issues are, evaluating and assessing it, and then implementing controls. I think for those on the line that aren't yet working with your health and safety professionals, I think you should be. We can contribute a lot, I think, to the discussion, and we can help implement controls to prevent some serious issues that could happen in a company. Or we can also, for example, share our perspective on things that we could allow that maybe we're not currently. I think that a lot of health and safety professionals work with the company on, for example, developing the insurance strategy or things like that that can actually help save the company money, by implementing certain programs or implementing certain controls than what the company is currently doing. And then I also think that for the health and safety professionals on the line, that we learn to communicate our value and that we maybe step out of our usual playing field to work with others and to make sure that we try to implicate ourselves wherever we can. I just wanted to share a word actually on IOHA today. I am currently in the role of president-elect, so I'm taking it upon myself to share with you what we're doing as an organization. And we are the International Occupational Hygiene Association. And essentially, we're an umbrella organization. We are the umbrella of many organizations, member organizations, we call them, across the world. We have approximately 36 at the moment, and we represent about 20,000 occupational hygienists worldwide. And we're a very small population in general. I think we've got barely over 30,000 in total. So what I just wanted to share with you is that if you are looking to work with occupational hygienists, on our website, the background of this slide is a sort of country map. You'll find those countries on our website, and then you can click on them to find the member organization near you. So if you're looking to work with occupational hygienists or learn more about the field, you can definitely do that on our website. And we also hold a triennial conference, which will take place in Dublin in 2024. So you would also be welcome to join us there. And what we also do is, you may have heard before of various professional certifications, like in the US, you have the CIH for industrial hygienists, you have the CSP for safety professionals. So we have actually, it's called the NAR, the National Accreditation Recognition Committee. And what they do basically is they look at bringing all of these certification schemes up to the same level so that they can be recognized globally. So right now we have 16 of those, meaning that if you have a hygienist that's certified in one of those 16 areas, that it's kind of been approved by us, or that they would be technically capable of working in any of those countries or those certification schemes. Also on top of that, we do some work to recognize and endorse different trainings, so occupational hygiene trainings, and notably one of those is the Occupational Hygiene Training Association. And with these training courses, you can also sit for this exam to become certified. So those are just a couple things I wanted to share with you today. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And I think after this, we have plenty of time for questions. Mohit's going to help us organize those, I think. And please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any further questions later, or to check out our website on IOHA.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha, for the wonderful presentations. And till yet, we don't have any questions. So any of our member, please, if you have any questions related to IH, then please drop your message on the chat box. We'll be happy to reply. Yeah, we can wait for a second. Let's see if if any questions come up. Yeah.
It's nice to see you on camera, Mohit.
Yeah, thank you. After a lot of struggle, checking the settings and other things. By the way, from my perspective, the presentation was definitely very insightful for us. And yes, you told right thing. Like in IH, we have lots of things, like lots of different categories of risk basically. And although like in manufacturing plant, yes, it is somehow manageable. But when we come to construction sites, or either in construction, if we talk about oil and gas or anything, so there is still, yeah, in terms of IH, we need to improve a lot. Either if we talk about welding, fumes, or noise, like lots of areas as aspects are there. So it is very much challenging, and yeah, great field to work on. I guess yes. I guess there's one question. So no, I don't think there is any questions. I hope the people have enjoyed it, and they have got the good insights about IH. And with this, I will thank you for taking out time and sharing the wonderful session insight with all of our members. And definitely in future also, I'll get back to you to find out some times and discuss more on this topic. So
Great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Mohit, we've just had a couple of questions. So
okay. Yeah.
Do you want me to read them out? So the first one, Samantha, is what is the difference in industrial hygiene and occupational health, and what are the similarities?
Yeah, great question. Industrial or occupational hygiene is mostly this concept of what we talked about today, looking at the actual exposures. Occupational health is almost the medical aspect of that. So, for example, that can be fitness for duty. So before workers come into a certain job or role, we make sure that they're fit for the job. It can be also medical surveillance. So when we are measuring or monitoring these exposures, there might be a biological aspect that we need to check on. We're able to do, for example, blood work to see how much of that product we find in the blood and if it matches with the air monitoring results that we found. It can be, I'm just trying to think, health record management, for example, making sure that any of the health data that we have on our workers, that we're managing that properly and confidentially. It's mostly the medical aspect of it.
Great, thank you. And then the next question is, how can you put into perspective the long latency period of health impact and risk management strategies?
That's a really good question. I would say, I'm trying to think of a similar aspect that we would look at. Sometimes there are other aspects of risk management that we also, it's a risk, right? It doesn't mean it's absolutely going to happen, but we have to do everything we can to prevent that. And so often it's the same thing in occupational hygiene, and the long latency is, if we do everything we can now, if we do the exposure monitoring we can, if we prove that we don't have this issue and we document it well, we implement the proper controls, then this risk shouldn't ever come. We should never have this happen in 20, 30, 40 years. So it's kind of about being upfront and proactive about the potential risk to ensure that it doesn't happen.
That's a great answer, thank you. We've got a number of comments saying thank you, great session, thanks very much for today's session. So that just leaves me to thank you, Samantha, for an excellent presentation and for giving up your time today, and to thank Mohit for organising this great session, and thank you everyone for attending. As usual, the recording will be on the IIRSM YouTube channel, probably today or tomorrow, and your certificates will come out tomorrow. So I'd like to wish everyone a good evening and hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye. Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Samantha.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.